The judge looked at the woman sitting alone at the defendant's table and asked, in the flat, impatient tone of a man who had seen too many hopeless cases, "Mrs. Ashby, do you have legal counsel today?" The courtroom tittered, not loudly, just enough. Her ex-husband, Fletcher Gaines, leaned sideways toward his attorney and said something behind his hand. The attorney, a man named Doherty, from the kind of firm that had its name etched in brass in a marble lobby, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Fletcher's new girlfriend, a 26-year-old named Brittany, who wore her highlight job like a crown, covered her mouth with manicured fingers. She wasn't hiding a cough. They thought they were watching a woman drown. What they didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew except the woman herself, was that the tote bag sitting beside her chair contained a phone that had just received a wire confirmation for $43 million, and the reading glasses she had bought at a gas station for $1.99 were the only things hiding the expression on her face that she could not afford to let them see yet. Her name was Zoelle Ashby. She was 31 years old. She was wearing a blouse she had purchased for $11 at a consignment shop in Decatur, Georgia, and in approximately 18 minutes, the world these people had built on top of her was going to come apart. The hallway outside courtroom 7 of the Fulton County Superior Court smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner. Zoelle had been sitting on a wooden bench outside for 20 minutes before they arrived. She had her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, the practiced stillness of a woman who had spent years making herself small. She heard Brittany first, the laugh. The kind of laugh that exists only to be overheard. "She's actually going to represent herself," Brittany said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Fletcher, she's actually doing it." Fletcher Gaines came into view a few seconds later. He was 40, broad-shouldered, and wore his confidence like an expensive coat. Something inherited rather than earned. He was the kind of man who shook hands firmly and said, "Great to meet you," to people he didn't care about. He had made Zoelle believe, for 6 years, that she was lucky to be chosen by someone like him. Behind him walked Doherty, his attorney, already reviewing something on a legal pad with the focused disinterest of a man billing $400 an hour. Fletcher slowed when he saw Zoelle. He stopped completely. He looked at her the way people look at a car with a flat tire on the side of the road. Inconvenienced, slightly pitying, already moving on. "Zoelle," he said. "Fletcher." She didn't stand up. Brittany pressed herself into Fletcher's arm. "I love your shoes," she said to Zoelle, in a voice that meant the opposite. Zoelle looked at her own shoes, sensible flats, scuffed on the left toe. She said nothing. "Doherty's going to make this quick," Fletcher said, his voice dropping just enough to seem private. "I don't want this to be ugly for you. Accept the settlement, $4,500 and you walk. That's it. You don't have any documented financial contribution to the marriage. You don't have your name on anything." He paused. "You never did." That last sentence was accurate, and both of them knew why. Zoelle had come into the marriage at 24, finishing a master's degree in computational biology, carrying a mind that moved faster than almost anyone she had ever met, and a trust so complete she had handed it over to Fletcher like it was nothing. She had deferred her own career, twice, for his job relocations. She had managed the house, the dinners, the holiday cards, the social calendar that kept his professional relationships alive. She had developed software tools in her spare time, small things, tools for analyzing biological datasets, that she gave away for free because Fletcher said her little hobby made him feel like she wasn't fully committed to their family. She had been so committed. That had been the problem. When she found out about Brittany, not from Fletcher, but from a photo his college roommate posted by accident on Instagram, she had not cried. She had sat very still in the kitchen for 4 hours and done what she had always done when the world around her stopped making sense. She started solving the problem. "I'll see you inside," Zoelle said quietly. Fletcher searched her face for something, fear, probably, or desperation, and when he found neither, he adjusted his cuffs and walked away. Courtroom 7 was smaller than the ones on television. The fluorescent lighting made everyone look as though they hadn't slept. The gallery held a handful of observers, a law clerk, 2 people who were clearly there for the next case, and an older woman near the back who had been knitting when Zoelle walked in and hadn't stopped. Zoelle sat at her table alone. No laptop, no legal pad covered in notes, just a single manila folder and, beneath the table, the tote bag. Fletcher's team arranged themselves with the comfort of people who had done this many times before. Doherty opened a laptop. A paralegal sorted color-coded tabs. Fletcher straightened his already straight tie. "Case number CV-2243847, Gaines vs. Ashby," the clerk announced. Judge Patricia Hollenbeck peered over her glasses. She was somewhere in her 60s, with the expression of a woman who had heard every variation of every story and was no longer surprised by any of them. Ashby, you are representing yourself today? Yes, Your Honor. A sound from Fletcher's side, not quite a laugh, adjacent to one. I want to advise you, Judge Hollenbeck said, not unkindly, that Mr. Doherty is an experienced family law litigator. I cannot provide legal guidance during proceedings. You proceed at your own risk. I understand, Your Honor. Doherty rose, buttoned his jacket. He had the measured cadence of a man who knew the room belonged to him. Your Honor, we appreciate the court's time today. This is a straightforward matter. My client, Miss Gaines, has offered a generous voluntary settlement to Ms. Ashby, which she has refused. The respondent made no documented financial contribution to this marriage. She held no employment for the final 3 years of the marriage. She is listed on no assets, no accounts, no property. Under Georgia law, given the brevity of commingled financial history, Miss Ashby's claim for equitable distribution is frankly unsupported. The marriage was 6 years, Zoel said. You may address the court when it is your turn, Miss Ashby, Judge Hollenbeck said, though not harshly. Doherty continued. Furthermore, my client has reason to believe the respondent has deliberately concealed financial assets. She refuses to account for income from so-called consulting work conducted from the marital home. We are seeking dismissal of any claim to marital assets and reimbursement of legal fees. Concealed assets. Zoel almost smiled. Mrs. Ashby, you may respond. Zoel stood. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Your Honor, I would like to request a brief recess of 10 minutes before I present my evidence. Doherty made a noise. Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. It is not, Zoel said simply. I'm expecting the arrival of someone who holds documentation that is material to this proceeding. They are in the building. Judge Hollenbeck studied her for a moment. Then she looked at the clock on the wall. 10 minutes, Miss Ashby, not 11. Fletcher turned and looked at Zoel with an expression that had shifted slightly. Not worry. Not yet. More like the moment before a wrong turn, when the road looks fine but something in the air is different. Zoel sat back down and checked her phone under the table. A text. 4 words. We're in the lobby. She exhaled through her nose. Slowly. The way she had been practicing for 6 months. The story of how Zoel Ashby became someone Fletcher Gaines had never bothered to look at closely enough is not a story about revenge. It is a story about the specific, clarifying power of being underestimated by someone who believes they know you completely. She had met Fletcher at a fundraiser in Atlanta, the kind of event her doctoral advisor had dragged her to for networking purposes. Fletcher was charming in the way of people who had been told all their life that they were charming. He was in commercial real estate. He made things sound simple. Zoel, who had spent most of her adult life in the specific complexity of biological data systems, found simplicity temporarily seductive. They married after 2 years. She was 25. She was still finishing her dissertation. Fletcher did not understand her research. He said so openly, laughingly, to other people at dinner parties. Zoel does something with cells and computers, he would say, waving a hand. Very smart stuff. Goes right over my head. People would laugh and look at Zoel with the fond, slightly patronizing smile reserved for wives who have interesting but impractical pursuits. Zoel would smile back and say nothing, because she had already understood that her intelligence, in this room, in this life, was decorative. She finished her dissertation. She deferred a postdoctoral offer at Johns Hopkins because Fletcher's firm opened a new division in Atlanta, and he needed her to hold things together at home for a year. The year became 3. She did not go back to academic research. Instead, she built things quietly. Tools. Algorithms. A proprietary data pipeline for processing genomic sequencing at a speed the existing software couldn't touch. She tested it. She refined it. She did not tell Fletcher, not because she was hiding it, but because he had never asked what she did when he was at the office. 18 months before the divorce, a pharmaceutical company in Boston reached out to her. Someone had used one of her free tools, traced it back to her, and wanted to know if she could build them something proprietary. She could. She did. They paid her through a small LLC she had formed, quietly, under her maiden name. That LLC had since entered into 2 additional contracts. The $43 million wire confirmation on her phone that morning was the close of the 3rd. She had not hidden this from Fletcher out of strategy. She had not told him because he had never asked what she was building. He had never once looked directly at what she was doing in the room down the hall. That was his failure of due diligence. She had simply stopped correcting his assumptions. The 10 minutes passed. The courtroom doors opened. 2 people walked in. The woman in front was perhaps 65, with silver hair cut close to her head, and a suit the color of graphite that cost more than most people's cars. She walked with complete unhurried authority, the way people move when they have never once in their life needed to rush to prove a point. Behind her came a younger man carrying a leather portfolio and a hard drive in a sealed evidence bag. Doherty saw the woman and stopped writing. Fletcher turned around. His face changed, not dramatically, just around the eyes. The woman walked to Zoel's table, leaned down and said something quietly. Zoel nodded once. Your Honor, Zoel said, rising, I'd like to introduce Dr. Helena Marsh, founder and executive chair of Marsh Genomics Group, who is present today as a material witness and as a representative of the business interests of Ashby Analytics LLC. Marsh Genomics, Doherty said, and his voice had lost something. Marsh Genomics Group was not a name that meant much to people outside the biotechnology sector. Inside it, the name meant something like the sound a room makes when someone very important walks in. Dr. Helena Marsh inclined her head toward the judge and took a seat at Zoel's table as if she had always been expected there. Ms. Ashby, Judge Hollenbeck said carefully, you may continue. Zoel opened her manila folder. She placed 3 documents on the table. Your Honor, the petitioner has claimed I made no documented financial contribution to this marriage and have no assets to disclose. That is incorrect. She slid the first document toward the bench clerk. Ashby Analytics LLC was formed 22 months ago under my maiden name. In that time, it has executed 3 contracts in the biotechnology sector. The most recent closed this morning. She paused. Total revenue to date, $47,300,000. The knitting woman in the back of the gallery stopped knitting. Brittany said audibly, what? Fletcher's hand resting on the table curled slowly into a fist. Doherty stood up. Your Honor, if this entity exists, it was formed using resources from the marital home, marital time, marital. The software was developed on my personal equipment, Zoel said, not raising her voice. Purchased with earnings from freelance work I conducted before our marriage. The intellectual property was developed entirely from my premarital doctoral research, which is documented in my dissertation, filed with Emory University in 2017. All of which predates the marriage. She slid the second document toward the clerk. This is a notarized valuation report from a third-party firm, confirming that the core algorithmic architecture of Ashby Analytica's primary product derives from work completed prior to the marriage. It is my separate property under Georgia law. Doherty was whispering rapidly to Fletcher. Fletcher was not whispering back. He was staring at Zoel with an expression she had never seen on him before. She continued. The petitioner has additionally claimed I concealed income. I did not. I disclosed the LLC in my financial affidavit, in Section 4, line 11. I note that the petitioner's legal team did not follow up on that disclosure. She looked at Doherty briefly, without malice. That is a failure of discovery, not concealment. Judge Hollenbeck had stopped writing. She was simply watching Zoel. What I am asking this court, Zoel said, is not for a share of my husband's assets. I want nothing of his. What I am asking is for the court to recognize that I entered this marriage with intellectual property, that I developed continuously throughout it, and that I am entitled to leave it with that property intact and undisputed. I am also asking the court to note that the petitioner opened 3 credit accounts in my name without my knowledge during the marriage. The documentation is the third exhibit. Doherty sat down. The credit accounts had been the thing that shifted Zoel from grief to focus. 8 months ago, when the credit bureau had sent a flag to an email address, Fletcher didn't know she had. 3 accounts, $62,000 in charges. A hotel in Scottsdale that Zoel had never visited. A jewelry store in Buckhead that had not sold anything to her. Judge Hollenbeck reviewed the documents for a long time. Then she looked up. Mr. Doherty, would you like to request a continuance? It was a lifeline, and they both knew it. Doherty conferred with Fletcher in rapid, tight-lipped exchanges. Fletcher's jaw was working. At one point he looked over his shoulder at Brittany, who was looking at the floor. Your Honor, Doherty said finally, we would like to request a brief continuance to review the respondent's new disclosures. Denied, said Judge Hollenbeck. You had discovery access. Miss Ashby disclosed this entity in her affidavit. The information was available to you. She set down her pen. I am ruling that Ashby Analytics LLC and all associated intellectual property constitute separate property under OCGA 1939, predating the marriage. That property is Ms. Ashby's alone. She turned to Fletcher's side of the room. I am additionally referring the matter of the unauthorized credit accounts to the District Attorney's Office for review. Mr. Gaines, you will want to consult with your attorney before leaving this building, today. Fletcher's face had gone the color of old chalk. As for the settlement offered, Judge Hollenbeck continued, looking at Zoel. Miss Ashby, are you willing to accept any portion of marital assets in lieu of litigation? No, Your Honor, Zoel said. I want nothing from this marriage except my name back and the freedom to leave it. The gavel came down. Court was adjourned. Zoelle did not look at Fletcher when she stood. She did not look at Brittany. She picked up her tote bag, nodded once to Dr. Marsh, and walked out through the heavy double doors into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights hummed, and someone 2 rooms down was arguing about a parking ticket. She sat back down on the same wooden bench she had occupied before. She put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. Not because she was crying, because she was finally allowing herself to feel how heavy it had been to carry all of it alone. Dr. Marsh sat down beside her. That was elegant, the older woman said. It was terrifying, Zoelle said, her voice muffled by her palms. Those are often the same thing. Dr. Marsh paused. The Oberlin contract, are you ready to discuss terms? Zoelle lowered her hands. She looked at Helena Marsh, this woman who had found her work in a research database 18 months ago, and sent a single email that had quietly changed the entire trajectory of what came next. Give me 24 hours. You have 12, Marsh said with a small dry smile. I have a flight to Zurich. The next 6 weeks were a controlled detonation. The credit account referral moved quickly, faster than Doherty had predicted. Fletcher's attorney had been confident the DA's office would decline to pursue something so domestic. But they had not accounted for the fact that one of the 3 fraudulent accounts had been opened with a forged signature, which moved the matter from civil to criminal, with a speed that surprised everyone except Zoelle, who had quietly forwarded the signature comparison to the DA's office 3 weeks before the hearing. She had not told anyone she was going to do that. Not even Dr. Marsh, Fletcher's attorney, negotiated. The charges were eventually reduced, a process that cost Fletcher his reputation in the professional circles, where reputation was the only currency that mattered. The firm he had been building a partnership track toward declined to renew his contract. The reason given was vague and professional. Everyone understood it. Brittany moved out of the apartment Fletcher had been renting in Midtown. An apartment Zoelle had found in the discovery documents and which had, it turned out, been paid for using a company card from Fletcher's firm. That became a separate problem entirely. Zoelle did not follow any of this closely. She knew the broad outline because it was unavoidable in her professional circles, and because a former colleague sent her an article with the subject line, "Saw this and thought of you," and a single exclamation mark. She read it once. She didn't save it. What she was doing, instead, was building. The Oberlin contract was the largest she had signed. Not in dollars, but in scope. Marsh Genomics wanted her pipeline deployed across 3 research hospitals as part of a clinical trial infrastructure overhaul. The work required her to hire. For the first time, Ashby Analytics had a payroll of 12 people, then 20, then 31, operating out of a converted warehouse space in Cabot Town that had once been a textile factory and smelled faintly of machine oil and old ambition. She hired a head of operations named Kwame. She hired 2 developers straight out of Georgia Tech who had the specific qualities she valued most, not genius, but the willingness to be wrong and try again immediately. She hired an office manager who kept a whiteboard of daily priorities in 3 colors and reminded Zoelle to eat lunch. She worked 14-hour days and slept 7 hours and ran 3 miles every morning in the dark before anyone else arrived. It was the closest she had come to happiness in years. Not because the work was easy, but because for the first time in a very long time, every hour of her day belonged to something she had chosen. The Forbes regional edition ran a profile on her in the spring. She had not sought it and tried once to decline it. Dr. Marsh had told her flatly to stop being foolish. "You are 31 years old," Marsh had said, "and you have built something that will outlast both of us. Obscurity is a habit, Zoelle. Break it." The photograph they used showed Zoelle standing in the warehouse, not posed but caught mid-motion between 2 workstations, her glasses pushed up on her head, pointing at something on a screen. She looked absorbed and slightly impatient and completely at home. She looked, her assistant told her later, like someone who owned the room because she had built it. She had kept one thing from the courtroom. Not as a trophy, not even as a reminder. The gas station reading glasses, in their flimsy plastic frame, now sat on the windowsill of her office, next to a thriving succulent and a sticky note that said "check compressor data" in Kwame's handwriting. She was not sentimental about them. They just happened to be useful, and she had never been in the habit of throwing away things that still worked. 3 months after the Forbes piece ran, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She was in the middle of reviewing a dataset and the call was probably a vendor. It was Fletcher. She stood very still in the middle of her warehouse office, looking at his name on her screen. Around her, 31 people were doing the work she had set in motion. The sound of keyboards and a shared Spotify playlist and someone laughing at something in the back corner. She let it ring. It rang again 20 minutes later. She let it ring again. She did not block the number because blocking felt like a decision made in reaction to him, and she had run out of those. She simply did not answer, and after the second call, he did not try a third. There is a particular kind of silence that follows, when you stop waiting for an apology that will never be adequate. It is not comfortable, exactly. It is more like the feeling after a long run, when you have reached the distance you set out to reach, and your body has stopped protesting. And you are simply standing still, breathing, looking at where you are. Zoelle knew what Fletcher would have said. She had imagined it enough times to recognize the shape of it, an acknowledgement that was also an explanation, an apology that was also a repositioning. He had never been able to do the first without doing the second. It was the central limitation of who he was. She had spent 6 years making herself smaller so that he could feel larger. She had done it so automatically, so thoroughly, that she had almost forgotten what her actual size was. The work had reminded her. She was not angry at him anymore. That had surprised her in the months since the hearing. She had expected anger to be the fuel that kept her going. Instead, it had burned off early, like fog in the morning, and what had been underneath it all along was just her. Her mind, her work, her appetite for the problem in front of her. The afternoon the Forbes piece went online, her mother called from Savannah, crying in the good way, the overwhelmed way. "I knew," her mother said, uselessly and perfectly. "Zoelle, I always knew." "I know you did, Mama. Your father wants to know if you need anything. Tell him I'm okay." She paused. "Tell him I'm actually okay." She went back to work. The dataset was not going to review itself. 8 months after the hearing, Ashby Analytics closed a Series A funding round at a valuation that put it on the radar of every major player in biotechnology infrastructure. Dr. Helena Marsh called it, in her dry way, a reasonable start. The press called it the fastest-growing biotech software company in the Southeast. Kwame called it a reason to finally get a real coffee machine for the warehouse. They got a real coffee machine. It was excellent. Fletcher Gaines, by that point, had moved back to his parents' home in Savannah, which was 40 minutes from where Zoelle's parents lived, and a fact she found, on the rare occasions she thought about it, more poetic than she deserved. He was doing something in insurance now. She had heard this secondhand, from someone who had run into him at a gas station. He had looked fine, the person said, a little quieter. He had asked how Zoelle was doing. The person had said she was doing well. That was, by any measure, an understatement. Zoelle was not a woman who gave speeches or issued statements or allowed herself to be photographed in dramatic silhouettes against city skylines. She did not do revenge as performance. What she had done because the work was real and the problem was solvable, and she was, as it turned out, exactly the person to solve it. But there was one morning, early, before the team arrived, when she stood alone in her office with her coffee, and looked out the window at the city coming to light in shades of gray and pale gold, and she allowed herself to feel, completely, without apology, the weight of what it had taken to get from that courtroom bench to this window. The $11 blouse was in a donation bag somewhere. The gas station glasses were on the windowsill. The tote bag had finally given out at one of the handles and she had thrown it away without ceremony. She had kept nothing from that life except the work that had always been hers. She drank her coffee. The city woke up around her. Somewhere downstairs, the new coffee machine beeped twice to announce it was ready. She picked up her phone and called Kwame. "Early this morning?" she said when he answered. "Already here," he said. "The Oberlin data came back overnight. You're going to want to see it." "I'm coming down," Zoelle said. She took the stairs. Not because the elevator was slow, but because she had always preferred to arrive places under her own power.